Trump threatens 35% retaliatory tariffs on Canadian dairy after alleged $3 billion shipment rejection. Read the headline splashed across U.S. agriculture blogs. Carney holds firm on supply management. Canada won't flinch under pressure, declared CBC's late-night bulletin. In the span of just 48 hours, what began as a cross-border disagreement escalated into a full-blown economic flashpoint. American farmers flooded social media, accusing Ottawa of sabotage. Meanwhile, in Quebec and Alberta, dairy boards quietly held emergency calls. But amid the noise and finger-pointing, one question lingers. Was this really about cheese or power? And if so, who just called whose bluff? For decades, the U.S.-Canada agricultural relationship was considered one of the most stable pillars of North American trade. American dairy cooperatives supplied surplus ingredients to Canadian processors during shortages. Canadian butter and specialty cheeses, in turn, filled gourmet aisles in U.S. cities. Cross-border dairy trade was modest in volume, but rich in symbolism, a quiet testament to continental cooperation. Under NAFTA, Canada retained its tightly controlled supply management system, balancing domestic production with high over-quota tariffs on imports. It wasn't a free market, but it was predictable. U.S. negotiators tolerated this arrangement, recognizing the political sensitivity of Canadian agriculture, especially in Quebec, where dairy is culture, not just commodity. But cracks began to show as American farm lobbies grew frustrated. They saw Canada's system as a wall, one that blocked U.S. exports while insulating Canadian producers from global competition. And when Donald Trump took office in 2017, that frustration found its megaphone. In 2018, during a speech in Wisconsin, Trump famously called Canada's dairy policies a disgrace, highlighting the infamous 270% tariff on overquota milk. While Canadian officials clarified that such tariffs only applied after exceeding negotiated import thresholds under NAFTA and later USMCA, the damage was done. Perception had shifted. Canada was no longer a quiet partner. It was painted as a protectionist stronghold. The renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA in 2020 brought further tension. Although Canada conceded small increases in market access, about 3.6% of its dairy market, many U.S. producers felt it was a hollow victory. Disputes over how Canada allocated that access, including claims of unfair quotas favoring domestic processors, festered for years. Now, in 2025, that long-simmering discontent has erupted again. Not in backroom trade talks, but in headlines, border inspections, and furious tweets from both sides. It started with a tweet. On a Tuesday morning in March 2025, Donald Trump, now the Republican nominee and de facto voice of U.S. economic nationalism, declared, "Canada is killing our farmers. Their 300% dairy tariffs are a joke. If Trudeau and Carney won't play fair, we'll slap a 35% tariff on every last block of Canadian cheese crossing our border." The post went viral in minutes. Within 72 hours, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, confirmed Trump's announcement wasn't just bluster, it was policy. A 35% retaliatory tariff would be imposed on Canadian dairy, lumber, and autos, effective in 2 weeks. Just like that, Washington had reignited a long-dormant trade war. But the dairy clause, specifically, hit a nerve. Although U.S. officials cited Canada's restrictive supply management system as the catalyst, industry insiders knew the timing wasn't random. Trump's re-election campaign was facing headwinds in rural states. In Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York, where dairy remains a political and economic backbone, Trump's support had wavered. His move was a direct appeal to these communities. "I will fight for you, even if that means taking on our neighbors." The administration's messaging framed the move as justice long delayed. American dairy has been denied fair market access for decades, said Deputy Trade Rep Karen Slater at a press briefing. "Canada's system is outdated and anti-competitive. We're simply leveling the playing field." But behind closed doors, the data told a more complicated story. U.S. dairy exports to Canada had actually grown slightly under the USMCA, though still limited. The issue wasn't volume, it was symbolism. The overquota tariffs of 200 to 300% were rarely triggered, but their very existence became political fodder. They were exaggerated, misunderstood, but highly effective for campaign optics. Adding fuel to the fire was the leaked memo from the U.S. Dairy Export Council, which warned that the retaliatory measures may provoke supply shocks if Canada cuts off fertilizer and potash exports in response. Yet the memo was buried, overshadowed by rally speeches and news clips showing Trump promising to take no prisoners. Meanwhile, Customs and Border Protection officers began ramping up inspections of inbound Canadian food shipments, ostensibly for safety, but conveniently timed. Dairy products bound for grocery chains in New York and Michigan were suddenly held for review. Exporters complained of mysterious delays, increased paperwork, and informal signals to pause shipments. Social media accounts amplified the chaos. Images of full trucks turned away, reports of rotting cheese on loading docks, speculation that over $3 billion in goods had been affected, but no official statement confirmed such figures. The lack of transparency only heightened tensions. The U.S. had made its move, forceful, populist, and calculated, but whether it was a policy play or a political stunt, it had provoked a storm on the other side of the border. Canada did not blink. In Ottawa, Finance Minister Mark Carney convened an emergency meeting with agricultural leaders, trade representatives, and provincial premiers. His message was resolute. Canada's supply management system is non-negotiable. We will not dismantle it for a few points in a polling average. Instead of scrambling to appease Washington, Carney leaned into Canada's strengths: consistency, coalition, and public trust in institutions. The federal government began by filing a formal complaint under USMCA's dispute resolution mechanism, arguing that the U.S. tariffs violated agreed trade rules. These are unilateral and unjustified, Trade Minister Melanie Joly said in a press conference. Canada has fulfilled every obligation under the treaty. But beyond legal action, Canada executed a strategic counteroffensive. First, targeted tariffs of their own. Within a week, Ottawa announced new levies on American dairy equipment, fertilizers, and select meat exports. These weren't just tit for tat, they hit at sectors politically sensitive in Midwestern swing states. A second wave of tariffs hit processed foods and prepackaged cheese snacks, carefully selected to disrupt U.S. consumer markets without alienating Canadian voters. Second, Canada restricted discretionary import permits for overquota dairy from the U.S., citing quality and compliance concerns. These weren't total bans, but they introduced enough uncertainty to stall American shipments. And perhaps most critically, the Canadian Dairy Commission ramped up domestic support. Subsidies were increased to offset potential oversupply. Emergency storage programs were activated, allowing dairy cooperatives to stockpile excess production rather than dump it. The image of Canadian farmers calmly adapting stood in stark contrast to American viral posts showing milk being poured down drains. In Quebec, a press release from the powerful Union des Producteurs Agricoles read, "We do not apologize for protecting our farmers, our communities, and our values. Canada will not be bullied." This sentiment resonated with the public. Unlike in the U.S., where partisan media fueled division, Canadian coverage across outlets, from CBC to Global News, largely portrayed the standoff as a test of sovereignty, not economics. Internationally, Canada began courting alternative partners. New deals with the EU and CPTPP nations were fast-tracked. Shipments of specialty dairy products once earmarked for the U.S. were redirected to Japan, Chile, and even parts of China. Privately, however, Canadian businesses were anxious. Exporters worried about long-term damage to U.S. relationships. Cross-border suppliers, particularly those in Ontario and British Columbia, warned of potential layoffs. Still, Ottawa's message remained clear. We will absorb short-term pain to defend long-term principles. And in a move that caught Washington off guard, Carney delivered a speech at the Toronto Board of Trade, declaring, "This isn't about tariffs, it's about trust, and Canada will not be coerced into sacrificing our system at the altar of short-term political gain." The crowd gave him a standing ovation. On the other side of the border, the applause was drowned out by another Trump tweet. By late April 2025, North America stood frozen in a dairy-fueled trade impasse. U.S. tariffs had taken effect, but their impact was ambiguous. Prices of certain cheese imports rose modestly, but grocery chains simply shifted to domestic suppliers or cheaper substitutes. Canadian exporters reported delayed payments and canceled contracts, but no mass recall or $3 billion rejection occurred, at least not officially. The numbers didn't add up, but the politics did. In Washington, lawmakers split along party lines. Democrats accused Trump of manufacturing a dairy crisis to boost his rural base, while Republicans framed it as standing up to unfair foreign barriers. Hearings were held. Data was cherry-picked. No one offered a solution. In Canada, the story was different, but just as intractable. Opposition MPs accused Carney of escalating tensions, but polls showed widespread support for his stance. Provincial leaders from dairy-heavy regions like Quebec and PEI stood united. Don't touch supply management. Meanwhile, cross-border businesses, those operating distribution, logistics, and wholesale trade, found themselves caught in the crossfire. Some halted operations, others rerouted goods through Mexico or the EU, a few laid off workers. All called for stability. The USMCA's dispute panel had yet to deliver a ruling, and neither side seemed eager to blink first. Trump threatened to expand tariffs to include maple syrup and beef. Canada hinted at expanding dairy subsidies and further restrictions on fertilizer exports. The tit-for-tat spiraled toward paralysis. And yet, beneath the diplomatic posturing, both governments faced the same underlying dilemma. Their political calculations were now welded to a binary narrative: win or lose. To compromise meant to appear weak, and so both sides stayed the course, even as it became increasingly unclear what the victory would be. The war over milk had become a referendum on control, nationalism, and who sets the rules in the new North America. In the quiet agricultural town of Saint-Hyacinthe, Quebec, often called the dairy capital of Canada, the fallout from the trade standoff was felt not in headlines, but in spreadsheets and schedules. From the outside, the Fromagerie Belle Vallée plant looked like business as usual. Trucks rolled in and out. Stainless steel tanks churned fresh milk into blocks of aged cheddar and artisanal brie. But inside the boardroom, the mood was tense. "We've lost 3 buyers in the U.S. market this month alone," said CEO Sylvain Morel in a press interview. "Not because they don't want our product, but because no one wants to deal with paperwork purgatory and border uncertainty." Belle Vallée, which once exported 15% of its production to small gourmet retailers in New England, now faced a growing surplus. With U.S. buyers backing out and the EU market already saturated with its own regional cheeses, the company had to pivot fast. They froze inventory, cut back production hours, and delayed expansion plans that had been in motion for 2 years. The pain rippled downstream. Dairy cooperatives that supplied the plant, including several family-run farms in Montérégie, reported a 6% drop in orders. Temporary contract workers, often students or recent immigrants, were let go first. The plant's full-time staff held on, but were warned of shorter shifts if the situation continued into summer. And yet, there was no public outcry. Canadians had weathered trade wars before, with the U.S. over softwood lumber, steel, even ketchup. What made this different was the creeping sense that this time, the target wasn't just policy, it was identity. Supply management in Canada is more than a tariff structure. It's a social contract, a promise of stability for farmers, fair pricing, and protection from market volatility. When U.S. politicians attack it, many Canadians hear something deeper, an attack on sovereignty and community. So, while St. Hyacinthe bore the brunt, it also became a rallying point. Politicians visited, local media covered the factory's struggle, and across Canada, grocery chains launched Buy Local Dairy campaigns. Not because of shortages, but out of solidarity. The toll was real, but so was the resistance. In Monroe County, Wisconsin, dairy farmer Jake Wilkins watched as his fourth-generation family operation teetered on the edge. "We've been hanging on by a thread since 2020, he told a regional radio station. "We thought things were turning around after COVID, but this tariff fight, it's just more chaos we didn't ask for." Wilkins doesn't export directly to Canada, but he buys fertilizer from a cooperative that does. And after Ottawa's retaliatory tariffs, prices shot up 15% in 2 weeks. His supplier cited cross-border disruption and supply chain reallocation, but to Jake, it all meant the same thing. Less margin, more debt. Worse, one of his largest clients, a processing plant in Minnesota that specialized in value-added cheese products, had just scaled back production. Their reasoning? Uncertainty in export markets, rising storage costs, and waning consumer demand in light of rising prices. So Jake dumped milk. Not all of it, but enough to spark another round of painful déjà vu from the COVID-19 collapse. He filmed the moment not for sympathy, but to document the absurdity of the system. "I'm being told to pour perfectly good milk down the drain, while Washington picks fights over cheese." And he wasn't alone. The American Dairy Coalition released a survey showing 21% of medium-sized farms in the upper Midwest had experienced indirect disruption from the Canada tariffs. That included contract cancellations, price stagnation, and increased input costs, especially for potash, 85% of which the U.S. imports from Canada. Meanwhile, consumer prices for dairy products in urban centers like Chicago and Boston ticked upward. It wasn't dramatic, a few cents here, 50 cents there, but enough for grocery chains to start blending more domestic substitutes and private labels. Politically, the backlash was messy. Some conservative voices blamed Canada entirely, calling for even more tariffs and suggesting the U.S. exit USMCA altogether. Others, including members of Congress from dairy-heavy states, privately urged the Trump team to cool it, fearing voter anger in districts already burned by inflation and labor shortages. In the end, Jake summed it up best. This was supposed to help us. Instead, it boxed us in. Again. 2 nations, 1 border, and a growing divide. What began as a trade dispute over dairy has morphed into a larger standoff about values, sovereignty versus market access, protection versus profit, nationalism versus integration. Neither side wants to fold, yet both quietly calculate the mounting cost of standing still. In the U.S., farmers face rising prices and market instability, not from foreign competition, but from the unpredictability of their own political leadership. In Canada, companies weigh loyalty to domestic policy against economic pragmatism, caught between public support and global demand. Trade agreements are supposed to prevent this. Yet even under USMCA, the rules bend under pressure from politics and power plays. And when that happens, it's not governments who pay first. It's workers, families, and communities. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fall apart trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and perspective below.